What's the creepiest declassified CIA documents you had access to? My father wasn't a spy, not in the cinematic sense anyway. There were no sleek cars, no tailored suits, no clandestine meetings in foggy European cities. He was an accountant for a government contractor, a man whose life seemed to be painted in 50 shades of beige. He went to work, he came home, he read the paper, and on weekends he'd take me fishing. He was just Dad. That was the man I knew. It wasn't until he passed away and I was left to sift through the sedimentary layers of his life, packed away in our dusty attic, that I found out about his other job, the one that happened in a windowless room, with nothing but a chair, a microphone, and the vast, silent darkness of the human mind. The box was unassuming, a simple cardboard file box with Project Stargate Archival stamped on the side in faded black ink. Inside, nestled amongst heavily redacted reports and training manuals filled with bizarre geometric patterns, were a series of cassette tapes. His name was on the labels, followed by a string of alphanumeric codes. I suppose I should have left it alone. Some doors are best left unopened, but this was my father, the most ordinary man I had ever known. And this box was a contradiction, a secret history I couldn't resist. That evening, I took one of the tapes and an old player down to the kitchen. The house was quiet, filled with the specific emptiness that follows a funeral. I made a cup of tea, the familiar ritual, a flimsy shield against the unknown. I pressed play. A sterile, clinical voice spoke first, listing a date, a time, and a target coordinate. Then, my father's voice filled the speaker. It was him, but younger, clearer. "I'm oriented," he said, his voice calm, professional. "I am moving towards the target." He was a remote viewer, a psychic spy. The government, in its Cold War paranoia, had poured millions into training people to see things across the globe using only the power of their minds. It sounded like science fiction, a laughable footnote in history. But listening to his voice, the conviction in it was unnerving. He began to describe the target. A concrete bunker, deep underground. He spoke of the damp chill in the air, the smell of ozone and wet earth. His descriptions were so vivid I could almost feel the cold seeping into my own kitchen. He detailed the layout of the rooms, the type of equipment, the number of personnel. It was a flawless auditory blueprint. The clinical voice would occasionally cut in, asking clarifying questions. "Can you read any text on the documents? Describe the insignia on the uniforms." For 10 minutes, it was the most fascinating and bizarre thing I had ever heard. And then, everything changed. There was a long pause on the tape. The low hiss of the magnetic ribbon filled the silence. "There was something else here," my father said, his professional tone wavering for the first time. "It's not on the manifest." The clinical voice asked for a description. "I can't," my father whispered. His breathing had become audible on the tape now, shallow and quick. "It's a shadow, a patch of wrongness. It doesn't belong." He sounded confused, but also deeply, profoundly afraid. He tried to describe it, his words stumbling over each other. "It wasn't a person," he said, "but it was intelligent. It was aware." He said he could feel it pressing against him, a mental pressure that felt like ice water flooding his skull. "The target is compromised," the clinical voice stated, flatly. "Disengage. Return to your point of origin." But my father didn't seem to hear him. "It knows I'm here," he gasped. "Oh God, it sees me. It's looking right at me." His voice was tight with panic. The sound started on the tape, a faint, rhythmic scratching. "Can you hear that?" my father asked, his voice a choked sob. "It's here. It's in the room with me." The clinical voice repeated the order to disengage, more forcefully this time. But it was too late. A scream tore from the speaker, a sound so full of raw, abject terror that I threw myself back from the table, knocking my chair over. It wasn't just a yell of fright, it was the sound of a mind being ripped apart. "It followed me back," he shrieked, his voice distorting the tape. "I tease not there, it's here." I teased. The tape cut to silence, an abrupt, shocking nothingness. I sat there on the kitchen floor, my heart hammering against my ribs, the silence of the house suddenly immense and threatening. A cold draft snaked across the floor, and I realized I was shivering violently, and that's when I heard it. From the attic, directly above my head, a faint, rhythmic scratching. It was the same sound from the tape, slow, deliberate. I scrambled out of the house that night and stayed at a friend's. I tried to reason with myself. It was an old house, a grieving mind playing tricks. But I couldn't forget the final document I'd glanced at in that box. It was a summary report, dated the day after the tape. It mentioned my father had suffered an acute psychotic break, but it was the last line that was burned into my memory. "Asset integrity compromised. Containment procedure initiated. Target entity unofficially designated the follower." I never went back into that attic. Sometimes, though, when I'm home alone and the night is still, I hear it, a faint scratching from the ceiling. And I know, with a certainty that freezes the blood in my veins, that whatever my father saw that day, whatever he brought back from that dark place, is still here, waiting. The story to my grandfather was what they used to call a company man. He spent 40 years working for the same aerospace contractor, a cog in the vast machine of the American military-industrial complex. He was a quiet man, a creature of habit who found comfort in routine and predictability. His passion was his garden, a meticulously kept patch of earth where he grew prize-winning roses. When he died, he left me his house, a modest suburban home where every object seemed to have been in the same place for decades. The task of cleaning it out felt like an archaeological dig through a life of quiet contentment. It was in his workshop in the garage, a place that always smelled of sawdust and oil, that I found the box. It was a heavy metal footlocker painted army green with no markings on it save for a stenciled number. It was locked. I assumed it was full of old tools or car parts, but the lock was heavy duty, far more serious than what you'd use to protect a wrench set. It took me the better part of an hour with a drill and a pry bar to get it open. The effort felt like a violation, a posthumous intrusion of privacy. When the lid finally popped, the contents were not what I expected. There were no tools. Instead, it was filled with schematics, technical manuals, and a single thick, leather-bound journal. The documents were bizarre. The letterhead read, United States Air Force, and the project title was Project Blue Book Special Report 14. But the drawings were on T for any aircraft I recognized. They were perfectly circular, disc-shaped crafts. The manuals were filled with complex physics and engineering calculations that were far beyond my comprehension. But the diagrams were unmistakable. They were blueprints for a flying saucer. My grandfather, the gardener, the man who couldn't operate a VCR, was seemingly involved in a project to reverse engineer an extraterrestrial vehicle. I laughed at first. It had to be a joke, a prank, some elaborate piece of fiction he'd cooked up. My grandfather didn't have a creative bone in his body. Then I opened the journal. His familiar, neat handwriting filled the pages. But the words were not his. They spoke of the artifact, a craft of non-terrestrial origin, recovered from the desert. He wrote about the material of its hull, a metallic substance that was impossibly light and resisted any attempt to cut or melt it. He detailed the propulsion system, which he described not as an engine, but as a gravity driver, that warped the fabric of space-time around the craft. It was all written with the dry, detached precision of an engineer, which made it all the more terrifyingly convincing. The journal became darker as the entries progressed. He wrote of the occupants. He never saw them, he said, but their presence was felt. The medical teams that had performed the autopsies were plagued by nightmares, strokes, and sudden, aggressive cancers. The engineering teams, including my grandfather, began to experience things. He wrote of seeing geometric patterns in his peripheral vision, of hearing a high-frequency tone that no one else could hear. He described a growing sense of paranoia, a feeling of being watched not by his superiors but by the silent, broken craft itself. He wrote that the technology felt alive, that it seemed to resist their understanding, actively seeding confusion and error into their calculations. The final entry was dated July 16, 1957. It was short, and the handwriting was erratic, almost illegible. It's in the numbers, he wrote. It's not a machine. It's a message, a virus. It spreads through comprehension. The more we understand it, the more it understands us. We tried to take it apart, but it was taking us apart all along, from the inside out. After that, the pages were blank. I sat there in the dusty garage, the smell of oil suddenly feeling suffocating. My grandfather had worked at that company for another 30 years after that final entry. He had come home every day, tended his roses, lived a seemingly normal life, but what had he been thinking? What silent battle was he fighting behind his quiet eyes? I slammed the footlocker shut. I wanted to burn it, to throw it in a lake, but I couldn't. It felt like a tomb, a cursed object. I ended up digging a hole in the backyard, in the middle of his pristine rose garden, and burying the entire footlocker deep in the earth. I sold the house a week later. I tell myself it was just a story, a fantasy my grandfather, a brilliant but bored engineer, created to escape the monotony of his life. But sometimes, when I'm working on a complex problem, a spreadsheet, a piece of code, I see them, fleeting geometric patterns dancing at the edge of my vision, and I hear a faint high-pitched whine in the silence of my office. I always stop what I'm doing immediately. I go outside. I look at the sky, and I wonder if I'm just paranoid or if I'm remembering a message that was passed down to me, a virus hidden not in blood, but in the cold, clean logic of the numbers. Story 3, I've always been drawn to the ocean. Not the sunny, postcard-perfect beaches, but the cold, violent coasts of the north. For the last few years, I worked as a marine biologist, stationed at a remote research outpost in the North Atlantic. Our job was to maintain a network of hydrophones, underwater microphones that monitored whale. It was a lonely job, mostly spent listening to the clicks and moans of cetaceans against the deep, constant rumble of the abyss. The equipment was old, Cold War surplus from the Navy's Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS. The official story was that it was built to track Soviet submarines. The unofficial story, the one whispered between researchers on stormy nights, was that it was built to listen for something else entirely. Most of the time, the work was monotonous. You'd listen to hours of recordings, filtering out the noise of shipping lanes and seismic activity to isolate the whale songs. but every so often, you'd catch something anomalous, a sound that didn't fit. We had a designation for them: unidentified acoustic events. Most were explainable: underwater landslides, distant military exercises, even the unique sound of a blue whale's heart. But one of them was different. It was nicknamed the bloop. It was recorded in 1997, a powerful ultra-low frequency sound that was picked up by sensors over 5,000 kilometers apart. My turn to hear it came on a Tuesday. The sea was unnaturally calm, a sheet of gray glass under a sky to match. I was running diagnostics on the live feed from the abyssal plane hydrophone, located in one of the deepest trenches in our sector. Suddenly, the waveform spiked. It wasn't the familiar pattern of a whale or a sub. It was a low resonant pulse, almost identical to the original bloop recording. But this was live. My heart hammered in my chest. Protocol was to record, document, and move on, but curiosity got the better of me. I bypassed the main server and routed the raw, unfiltered audio directly to my headphones. I put them on and closed my eyes, trying to place the sound. It was deep, a vibration I felt in my bones more than I heard with my ears. It was organic, like the call of some impossibly huge creature. It repeated, once every 2 minutes, a slow, deliberate beat from the crushing dark. I listened for almost an hour, completely mesmerized. This was the discovery of a lifetime, a creature larger and louder than a blue whale, living in the sunless depths. Then, the sound began to change. The pulse shortened, quickened. It started to sound less like a call and more like speech, syllables, intonations. It was a language spoken in a voice as deep as the ocean itself. A cold dread washed over me, a primal fear that had nothing to do with scientific discovery. This was not an animal, this was intelligent, and it was getting closer to the hydrophone. The signal was getting louder, the details of the alien's speech becoming clearer, though no more comprehensible. I could hear other sounds now, too, a scraping like immense claws dragging on rock. Then, I heard a voice, a human voice, faint, tinny and terrified, layered beneath the abyssal language. It was an old recording, bleeding through from somewhere. Mayday, 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 it said. USS Triton, we are being pulled down. Something has us. The voice cut out, replaced by a sound of groaning, twisting metal, and then a final, catastrophic implosion. The Triton was a submarine that had vanished without a trace in that very sector in 1968. At that exact moment, the abyssal voice on my headphones stopped speaking. It was replaced by a single, sharp, clear sound, a click, the sound of a microphone being switched off. Then, silence. The live feed was dead. An error message flashed on my screen. System error. Hydrophone number 7, abyssal connections severed. I tore the headphones off. I never told anyone what I heard. I filed a report stating the hydrophone had malfunctioned and gone offline due to a suspected seismic event. I resigned a month later. I live in the desert now, as far from the ocean as I can get, but I can't escape it. In the dead of night, when the wind howls, I can sometimes hear it. A deep, resonant pulse, carried on the air. And I know that what the Navy built their system to listen for wasn't Russian. It was something much, much older, and I think, on that day it finally realized we were listening, and it simply reached out and hung up the phone. Story for my first job out of college was with the National Archives. It wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. Mostly, I was a paper pusher, a glorified librarian dealing with documents that were either so boring or so obscure that no one had looked at them in 50 years. I was assigned to the Declassification project, which was even less exciting. My job was to go through boxes of once sensitive material, mostly from the CIA and Department of Defense, and prepare them for public release. It was 99% mundane procurement reports and redacted memos. It was that final 1% that made me quit. The document in question was part of a collection related to Project MKUltra, the infamous mind control program. But this was from a sub-project I'd never heard of, codenamed Project Winter Dream. The file was thin, containing only a single-page memo and a transcript. The memo was brief, authorizing a field test for a new psychotronic compound combined with auditory neurological programming. It stated the goal was to see if a specific, targeted memory could be implanted in a subject without their knowledge. The test subject was designated as the Wanderer. The location was a remote stretch of highway in rural Nevada. Then there was the transcript. It was from a police interrogation. A state trooper had picked up a man walking alone on the highway in the middle of the night, miles from anywhere. The man was disoriented and had no ID. He couldn't remember his name or where he came from. Most of the transcript was the officer trying, and failing, to get any information from him. The man just kept repeating the same phrases. The house is not real. I have to get back to the birch trees. She's waiting for me under the red light. He sounded confused and terrified. The trooper, thinking he was on drugs or having a mental breakdown, took him to the nearest county hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. A doctor's note was attached to the transcript. It said the man was physically healthy but suffering from a complete dissociative fugue state. He was a John Doe. This alone was strange, but it was the final piece of paper in the file that chilled me. It was a photograph, a grainy black and white photo of a young woman with dark hair, smiling. She was standing in front of a small white house with a single birch tree in the yard. Above the front door was a porch light with a distinctively red-colored bulb. On the back of the photo, a single sentence was typed, "Programming complete. The subject is now searching for a memory that does not exist." I felt sick. This wasn't a report. It was a ghost story written by government bureaucrats. They hadn't just drugged a man, they had hollowed him out and filled his head with a phantom life. They had given him a memory of a woman, a home, a love that never existed, and then abandoned him on a desert road to chase it forever. He was a lab rat, and the maze was his own mind. I sat there in the silence of the archive, the hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly feeling malevolent. What happened to that man? Did he spend the rest of his life searching for the smiling woman in the house with the red light? Did he ever realize that the most important memory he had was a lie, carefully constructed and planted in his brain? I processed the document as required. I stamped it, filed it, and sent it on its way to be released to the public. Just another strange footnote in a sea of declassified files. But I couldn't shake the feeling of profound violation. The CIA hadn't just broken a man's mind. They had weaponized the very concept of home, of love, of memory. They had created a perfect, personalized hell for him. I quit my job the next week. I couldn't stand being the curator of such quiet atrocities. I think about him sometimes, the man they called the Wanderer. I imagine him out there even now, an old man still walking the back roads of America forever, searching for the warm glow of a red porch light and a woman who was never anything more than a photograph in a forgotten file.